Попрошу технічну команду підійти, допомогти налаштувати звук.
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrenergo. My name is Olha Atamanova. It's been 10 years of the war, and today is day 771 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And we all see that the massive strikes do not stop. So today we will be talking about the insights into Ukrainian power system operations after the massive Russian attacks in March this year. Joining us in our studio is Volodymyr Kudrytskyi, chairman of the board of NEC Ukrenergo. Mr. Volodymyr, good afternoon. So let's talk about the aftermath of the massive strikes. What is the situation for the time being, and what are the plans to reinforce our protection? Good afternoon, everybody. Recently, in the majority of the regions, there was an announcement of end of the heating season, and just a couple of days before, on the 22nd of March, Russia inflicted a massive combined drone and missile strike on the power grid of Ukraine. And since then, with a different intensity, those attacks of Ukrainian power grid are continuing. As a result of such attacks, there was a number of important facilities damaged. The biggest damage was inflicted on the power plants that generate energy. I mean, hydraulic power plants, thermal power plants, and also damaged by the attacks were the transportation facilities. I mean, the energy power transportation facilities. So the enemy tried since 22nd of March until this very day to damage the capacities of Ukraine in terms of transportation and generation of electric power, trying to deprive some large cities such as Kharkiv, Odessa, Kryvyi Rih, and others of the supply of electric power. Right after the first massive strike, the problems had arisen with power supply in a number of regions, including Kharkiv, where the situation is difficult until this very day. And also such regions are Dnipropetrovsk, Khmelnytsk region, and Odessa region. In a number of regions, the problems were mitigated. I mean, the consumers are currently getting the supply of electric power. In Kharkiv, the situation is unfortunately still difficult. Just this night, there was yet another attack on a large energy infrastructure facility in the region, and for the time being, there are certain restrictions on electric power supply in Kharkiv region. There is a restriction imposed for some industrial consumers in the Dnipropetrovsk region. The enemy continues their attacks almost on a daily basis. Well, there was a number of massive strikes. Well, they were not coming every day, but the Shahed strikes on the energy infrastructure facilities are happening almost daily in a number of regions. Those are mainly the regions located along the front lines. And currently, as I've mentioned, there is a significant number of hydraulic and thermal power plants that are damaged, that impacts the supply of electric power and balancing of the supply. I'm talking about the power plants that ensure the balancing of the power grid within the day. So the concept of the Russians has not changed. Their tactics has changed. They use the combined strikes. They combine different types of missiles with the drone strikes. Also, it's safe to say that the intensity of the strikes has grown. What I mean by that is that, for example, in comparison to the previous heating season, we were observing one massive strike within like 1 or 2 weeks, and it was either Shahed or missile attack. Now it's a series, uninterrupted series of attacks, and talking about the number of Shaheds that enemy was using to damage or to attempt to damage our energy infrastructure facilities. Only within the last 2 weeks, this number has grown up to the number that we were documenting within the whole couple of months of the heating over the previous heating season. So the enemy puts high stakes on their loitering drones, but they also use a large number of missiles to inflict damage on our energy infrastructure facilities, both generating and transportation facilities. In this regard, I mean, it's clear that we work 24/7 on restoration of the facilities, not only in those regions where there are still problems with power supply, but in fact in all regions that were affected by the attacks where there is no restrictions on the power supply. We still try to restore the most equipment possible to reinforce the resilience of the regions to the possible future attacks of the enemy. Now we entered into the period of preparation to the following heating season. We're modeling different scenarios and we're discussing what needs to be done to make sure we make through it with the less risk possible in a balanced way. But on top of this, on top of other tasks that are related directly to the restoration, there's yet another aspect that I want to emphasize today, is the way how we can counter Russian attacks in the medium-term perspective and how to ensure the resilience of the Ukrainian power grid at the same time. I mentioned it multiple times that it will be difficult to keep restoring the damaged power plants that were built back in 60s, 70s of the previous century. And all of them were damaged by missiles or other means a number of times, and definitely their technical condition is not improving as a result of those attacks. The Ukrainian power grid depends a lot on a small number of large electric power plants, if we talk about the generation of electric power, and the enemy focuses specifically on those power plants because you know this focusing of generation in some specific places, in some specific in a number of specific platforms is something that results in significant problems when the enemy uses the tactics of massive strikes. So now, as an operator of the power grid, we are responsible for modeling of the power grid for the future, what needs to be done, how the power grid should develop, and these calculations are made by Ukrenergo, and we understand that the only sustainable way to ensure the proper operation of power grid and its protection against the massive strikes is decentralization of generating facilities. So instead of having 15 or 20 big power plants, we need to build hundreds of the new ones that will be more resilient to such attacks due to their dispersion. And the number of missiles that we're observing now that inflicts damage on that limited number of facilities, it would not be able to inflict such difficult damage for the power grid in case if we would depend on a large number of small power plants. So taking an example of big cities that Russians continuously keep trying to deprive of the electric power. I'm talking about Kharkiv specifically this time, but just recently, let me remind you, there were problems with power supply in Odessa, which resulted from Russians' attacks. Also, Dnipro, Lviv, and Kyiv were impacted by the missile strikes previous year. Also, in February this year, Russians were targeting the power infrastructure that supplies the that ensures the uninterrupted power supply to Kryvyi Rih. So Russians are trying to cut the power supply from the big cities, and we were trying to demonstrate how the dispersed generation will contribute to the resilience and sustainability of power supply to the cities. On the first picture, you see the scheme of the power supply from big electric power plant to the final consumer, to some city. It goes through Ukrenergo transformer substations, then through the networks of Oblenergo or regional distributor that are not being shelled due to their dispersion or their dispersed nature. And if enemy manages to inflict damage on some infrastructure facility that feeds some big city, it immediately results in problems with power supply to this city. And if, unlike that, there will be a number of small generation facilities in this city itself or around it, like 1, 10, 15, or 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 gigawatts installed around the city, they will be able to feed their power into Ukrenergo networks, and that will prevent the significant damage in case of strikes, and even in case of damage of a large power plant damage, the city would still be able to continue getting power from the small substations or the small dispersed generation on the local level. The way it should be looking on the map, as I mentioned, it should be represented by hundreds of such facilities. Currently, there are wind and solar power plants being built in Ukraine. Currently, they are built without green tariff, only based on the forecasts of these or those investors, mostly Ukrainians, that are based on the price of the electric power that they will be able to sell it at. And in addition to those solar and wind power plants that depend on the weather mostly, we also need some balancing technologies. As I've mentioned, this time we're counting on hydraulic and thermal power plants. The problem is that they are mostly the targets of the enemy, and we need other balancing facilities. And in correspondence to our modeling and our calculations, we need such technologies as gas peakers with high maneuverability, modern small power stations that work on gas. We need power accumulation systems that would allow during periods like this during the day to save the power from solar power plants and consume this energy in evening time when we may have deficit. Also within that, we need more thermal generation for our power grid that would be based not on the fossil fuels such as gas or coal, but on renewable power sources such as the agricultural complex waste or others. I mean, they can be biogas, biomass, thermal power plants that would play the role that is currently being played by the coal generation for the power grid. And as you see, all those power plants should be geographically dispersed all across Ukraine. The location can be dictated either by the availability of fuel or by the availability of network infrastructure, so those power plants can feed their electric power directly to the grid. So to make sure that all these three types of technologies develop in Ukraine, just like wind and solar power plants, we need to have some conditions created, certain conditions created. We're saying that for the Ukrainian power grid is the matter of energy security, to make sure that the investors build a large number of such small power plants that I've mentioned. And if talking in very simple words, the investor needs two things. They need to understand how they will get the return on their invested capital. So they need to understand how their investments can be reimbursed, and there is a mechanism for reimbursement of such investments. Us as a power grid operator, we buy systemic services that are called auxiliary services. So basically we procure the readiness of the power plant to support the power grid in case it needs some additional load or unload. And in the market of auxiliary services, the, the cost of those auxiliary services allows paying back the investments, and there are no debts there. Sorry, no debt there. So to achieve the zero debt indicator, Ukrenergo raised certain financial support from international financial organizations, having repaid the debt that was existing back then, and it was not arising since then. So it's a sustainable segment of the market from the financial point of view that the investor can count on for the time being. But there is a problem with another element that investor needs: how they can repay their operational costs, like for generation of this electric power. For gas power plant, it will be the cost of gas that they need to procure to generate power. For biogas plant, it will be the cost of procurement and supply of the fuel. Or for battery power plant is like charging this same battery when the operator charges them and then discharges. So those costs for those facilities will be repaid in the segment of the market which is called balancing market. So the station provides the balancing services, and the specific segment of the market where those services are sold, this balancing electric power is being sold. This is where the investor can repay their costs for the gas, for biofuel, or other operational costs. This market is severely indebted for the time being, because those power plants that provide the balancing power for the time being, thermal and hydraulic power plants, they are capable of generating the energy for those consumers that need additional amounts, but not all of the consumers can pay back for the services. Ukrenergo is the mediator in this segment of the market. So Ukrenergo has debt in front of the stations, and the consumers, they still have their debts in front of Ukrenergo. So let me remind you right away that we're not talking about the utility consumers, but we're talking about some industrial consumers. 70% of them are like utility companies and coal mines, Teplokомуненергos, Vodokanals, and state-controlled companies that usually do not pay back for the consumed electric power. And in this segment of the market, the presence of the debt and the fact that it's growing is something that intimidates the investors. So we need to have the issue of the balancing market solved to make sure that we see the construction of new electric power plants all across our country. And solution of this problem is made up of two parts. First, we need to stop growing the debt, first of all, and here we have to start talking about the list of the protected consumers that are critical to this or that reason, and they cannot be disconnected from the power supply. And in this case, they should be supplied with electric power under some specialized mechanism, and others are supposed either to pay for the electric power or have them disconnected if their generation or if their companies are not critical. Yet another part of the problem is repayment of the existing debt, and here we cannot count on having 30 billions that are owed to us by the consumers who were consuming the electric power for years or decades, and we're not paying for it. We'll pay back like tomorrow. So unfortunately, we cannot count on having our debts paid so that we can repay our debts in front of the generating facilities. Thus, Ukrenergo will enter into negotiations with our foreign partners, and after the growth of the debt in the balancing market will be stopped, we will have to discuss the stable debt, the residual debt, to have financial support raised to repay the debt, to create, in fact, the financial opportunity for the investors to start investing in the dispersed power generation. I want to emphasize that this is the task that we set for ourselves to be solved this year in coordination with other institutions, of course, that will be involved in solution of this problem. So this year we want to fully solve the issue of the debt in the balancing market. And the sooner we do it, the sooner we will be able to see the first projects for construction of dispersed generation in Ukraine. I would like to emphasize that the funding for this such an ambitious task, because this problem is not like 1 or 2 years old, but it's almost 20 years old. So we want to raise this funding in a way not to increase the load on our tariff and not to increase significantly the credit load for the company. So we're going to look for some efficient financial instruments without significant impact on the industrial consumer. And finally, I would like to say that on top of the strategic effect of opening the new segments of the market, opening of new technologies that are supposed to be built in Ukraine, also we need to solve the problem of the balancing market to provide the financial resource to the state-controlled companies, those which are working in the sector of thermal and hydraulic power generation, to mitigate the damage that was inflicted on them during the latest attacks. So for this year, this goal is one of the key goals for us, and its implementation will yield a lot of positive results for the resilience of our power grid for the heating season to come and in the long-term perspective as well. Thank you. Mr. Volodymyr, is this model that you've presented with the decentralization of the generation facilities, is it already approved by the state of Ukraine, or the improvement is still pending? And do you already have calculations of time and money for implementation of such problems? Well, the money for implementation of this project should be raised from the private investors, so the state can only create the conditions to make sure that this type of project is readily implemented by the investors. It does not reduce the capabilities of the private sector to take part in this process, but the main stake is on the private investments from our point of view. But given the fact that we're talking about hundreds of facilities, I mean, that's a huge number, and it will require a large number of developers, contractors, and so on. Talking about whether it's already approved or not, we have such a document that we update every year. It's called the report on relevance of the generating capacities. In this report, we provide the information about what the power grid should look like in the mid and long-term perspective, what should be the structure of generation, in a way to make sure that the power grid is sustainable, so it covers the needs of the consumers and at the same time is the cheapest possible. So we're looking to such a mix that is optimal for Ukraine. And this report is being approved by the regulator on an annual basis. So this year it was approved by the regulator. It happened way before the shellings, before the strikes, but the global goal of decentralization is not changing. The number of power plants to be constructed is clearly indicated in this report as well, and also this report is fundamental for preparation of the energy strategy of the state. So this idea is not new for sure. It was discussed last year before the end of the previous heating season. We just need to make sure that this sector becomes a priority, because it's clear that it's becoming clear that our existing grid, the power plants and the permanent and the continuous strikes cannot grow the generation of the electric power. We just need the new generation facilities that would ensure proper supply of electric power to the Ukrainian power grid. But in the long-term perspective, if Ukraine wants to be a serious player in the European energy market, if we want to be a factor of energy security, not only for ourselves but for the whole region, it's clear that we need new generation capacities. Well, basically this is the idea. So getting back to the topic of the massive strikes of the Russians, we understand, everybody basically understands that for Russia, their goal is to destroy our power grid, and they will take all efforts to achieve that goal. So we're basically through our heating season already. There are some restrictions in certain cities. I mean, the restriction of electric power supplies. So to what extent is it safe to say that there is a risk of scaling up such restrictions? Well, it completely depends on the nature, frequency of the potential attacks. So it's difficult to forecast something without knowing when and how the Russians will inflict another strike on our power grid again. So they're trying to do this, they're trying to destroy their power grid from the very first days of the invasion. They were just using different tools for that. They were using different tactics. But the Ukrainian power grid is under enemy strikes for a long time. Even before the 22nd of March, let me remind you, in February we had a number of waves of attacks on the energy infrastructure facilities with the Shahed drones, and it's just another evidence that we don't have a right to relax until we win. We don't have a right to be complacent, to think that the threat is not existing anymore. The risks are still there, and it's clear that as long as they strike us, we will be recuperating. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Do we have any questions on the floor? Oksana Polishuk, Ukreninform. You've mentioned the amount of debt of Ukrenergo in the balancing market, but what is the general amount of debt in the energy market? It reduced a little bit in December. We were saying that the figure is 60 billion hryvnias. Currently this indebtedness is at the level of about 52-53 billion in total. The amount of debt has reduced thanks to the fact that we were paid for dispatching. So basically the tariff that is paid by the businesses for transportation and management of electric power facilities. The debt is growing, unfortunately, in the balancing market, and currently it achieved the level of more than 31 billion hryvnia. Another question, Reuters, if I may, a couple of questions. Can you please clarify the situation with exports and imports of electric power? Another question, we're planning to build the third and fourth reactor on the Khmelnytskyi power plant. Do we have enough transportation capacities to retrieve that power from that facility? And given the last strikes, to what extent this capacity to transport electric power has diminished? Well, after this wave of attacks starting from the 22nd of March, we observe change of the situation. Previously there was import prevailing export, export prevailing import, so we were exporting the excessive generation, and we did not have any need to import anything, but now the situation has changed. Import was helping us to balance the system, specifically during the very first days after the attacks. Currently, the import is prevailing over export significantly. Export is at 0 mark, and only during specific hours, for example, during the day, when the solar activity is high, the consumption falls. Well, it may fall on a day off, for example. So if we have any excess of electric power in the solar power plants, we have choice to either restrict them or to export this electric power without any harm for Ukrainian consumer, because during this specific moment it may be excessive. So it's only then when some restrictions on import or export are allowed. Also, export can be happening during nighttime when consumption falls, and this electric power, we have nowhere to use it. For example, if there is high activity of wind power plants, their megawatt hours can be exported to Europe. During all other hours, the export is at 0. Specifically during evening time when consumption is growing, usually import from Europe is growing too. Today, import from Europe during evening hours is significant, and it significantly supports the balance in our power grid. We have more questions. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, and talking about the third and fourth reactor, I apologize. Yes. So their construction still takes certain time. And during that time, relevant networks will be prepared so this capacity can be fed into the grid. So let me assure you, without excessive details, that the networks will not be a constraining factor for feeding their generation capacity to the grid. So when those reactors will be built, the network will be ready to accept all of the capacity of those reactors. Talking about the fall of the thermal and hydraulic power plants in the general balance, I would not comment the figures in order not to give the Russians the general picture of impact of their attacks on our power grid. Another question. Mr. Volodymyr, you've mentioned that the debt has grown on the balancing market, but you've said that when the moratorium is lifted, it will be positive for balancing markets. So basically, there were no changes after the moratorium was lifted. Well, there were changes because before the moratorium was lifted, more than 5,500 companies ended up on the protected list, so they could not be disconnected in case of debt, and the majority of them accepted it as an indulgence for their debt. Now this list way smaller, and from that point of view it did help, but there is a seasonal factor existing there, that before the end or in the beginning of the new year, due to some specific characteristics, specifics of the operation of the state companies, not everybody makes it within this small period, having those bids in Prozoro. And those who don't make it within this period, by the end of the year, they go to the last resort supplier in the beginning of the year. That results in growth of the debt. Hopefully by the summer period this phenomena will diminish, but we have to recognize that those, let's call them traditional non-payers, which existed before the middle of December 2023 until the moratorium was lifted, to a certain extent they still exist, not so much, but they continue consuming the electric power from the grid without paying for it in full. So we need additional measures to solve this residual problem with the non-payers, and those measures are in creation of exclusive list of companies that cannot be disconnected, but in their turn, these companies should sacrifice something, they should concede something. For example, they should automatically transfer part of their income for in settlement for the supply of electric power. So basically, if they do not consume power but they do not pay for it. So if I may ask, is the work already underway on this list? Yes, the work is already underway on this list, and it's not only about the list but on the whole structure. It's not simple. As I've mentioned, the problem exists for decades in Ukraine, and in the old model of the market, this problem of non-payers, it did exist. So the solution is not, is not simple, and it's not like one component or something direct. So it's a huge complex of standards that should be adopted or changed to make sure that the situation improves and that debt starts growing. As soon as it stops growing, we will have the window of opportunities open for the negotiations to repay that residual debt that will be fixed. Thank you. We're having a question from the colleagues who listen to us online, Anastasia Gasan, Ukrenergo. So how did the balance of generation of electric power has changed after the 22nd of March? So let's go one by one. As I've mentioned, thermal and hydraulic power plants were affected by the strike. So they reduced their generation, but I'm not going to disclose the exact numbers. We were importing electric power from Europe. Now, thanks to the warmer weather, the consumption in the power grid is fallen, so there is no acute deficit that we would observe. However, I would say that there is the seasonal growth in the solar power plants, and by the way, yesterday the enemy probably for the first time inflicted a strike on the solar power plant in Dnipropetrovsk region. I think it's the first time that I remember the targeted strike on the renewable power infrastructure facility. So it was not like random or as a part of battle operations in the front line. So it was a targeted attack of a solar power plant deep in the rear. So basically, I think the enemy understands it. There is this seasonal factor. So it's clear that solar power plants generate the most power during the daytime, and there are certain needs of the power grid for balancing that result from there. For example, during the day, instead of restricting this power, we may preserve it in the industrial batteries, and then in the evening feed it to the system when it's mostly needed. And another question, whether the generation of electric power based on gas can grow over the indicators of the year 22. We're still in the process of modeling for the month to come, and for the period of years 24-25. I don't have the finalized numbers so far. It's difficult to comment something, but it's not it's a possible option, because the gas-based generation in summer last year, it supported our power grid, specifically during the periods when the temperatures were high, and the use of the conditioning systems were resulting in growth of power consumption. Mr. Volodymyr, I would like to get back to the problems of Kharkiv that they're facing as a result of massive Russian strikes. So the local authorities were saying that to restore their thermal power plant, it will take years. To are we ready to such restoration from the technical point of view, from the point of view of availability of parts, and does it make any sense to proceed to such restoration if we proceed to this model of decentralized generation? Well, the future model that we're discussing is deployment, and full implementation will take time. Well, a couple of years. And respectively, we are not at liberty to refuse the existing facilities and focus on construction of the new ones. We have to do all things at the same time. So restoring something that can be restored is necessary, even regardless the risks of shellings. Last season, after very significant destruction in hydraulic and thermal power plants, a lot of generation was restored that enabled us to make it through the whole winter. Well, except for the February 2024, when strikes on the Dnipropetrovsk region had started. But you remember, in the winter there were no shutdowns. Remember, at least due to the deficit of electric power, there could have been some local damage in the areas along the front lines and something resulting from bad weather, but that's traditional. But yes, we have to restore them. Everything that can be restored should be restored. I don't want to give any comments about Kharkiv thermal power plant because it's a sensitive topic, and what is gonna happen there should not be commented in public space, I think, but the approach should be such that everything that can be restored, if its capacity can be increased, if it's some local thermal power plant that has not been generating electric power for years, but it can be connected to the grid and continue generating the power. Further on, given some investments, it should be done as well. So we need to prepare as much generating capacities as possible for the summer, for the winter, and at the same time to continue deploying the decentralized generation. And this is the only way that we will be able to maximize our chances for sustainable electric power supply and to mitigate the risks that Russians try to create for us on a continuous basis. I would like to thank you for this briefing. Joining us was Volodymyr Kudrytskyi, and Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum will be back online at 1 o'clock, and we will present an event in support of the main Directorate of Intelligence. Thank you for staying tuned. Glory to Ukraine.